the accumulation of knowledge just to stack up knowledge is sort of like somebody who accumulates money and just sticks it in a mattress or sticks it in a vault somewhere, right? I mean, there is value there, but it's not realized value because it's not working at all. Money stuck in a vault may be safe, but it's not earning anything. It's not being put to work. Money that would be really working would be money that gets invested into businesses and ventures, some of which will be successful, some of which won't be. But that's money that actually makes a difference in the world. And we would say the same thing about knowledge, that you have to ask and you have to ask questions and you get information and you accumulate that information. But for the information to really make a difference in the world, to mean something, it has to be put to use. And that's the action point. And that requires both the will to put it to use and the understanding of what's going on. It also requires the understanding that putting it to use may result in things not going the way you expect. Welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. My name is Jonathan Brush.
And I'm David Rethemeyer.
And we're delighted to be with you once again, talking about some of the educational framework that we use for Unbound. And again, just a quick disclaimer, while we do use it for Unbound, and so it might be helpful to understand those programs, we're not presenting it here as an advertisement necessarily for Unbound. We won't hurt feelings if you go to our website to learn more about us, but more as a structure that we think is helpful to interpret some of the world and some of the things that are important for young adults to learn based on our experience working with young adults in Unbound. And so last episode, we talked about ASK, which is this idea that we live in a questions-based paradigm rather than an answers-based paradigm, and we went into that. Now, as you go through this acronym, it's ADULT, ask, do, understand, live, thrive. And so next in the series here would be do, and we're going to talk about that. But there is a little bit of a problem here that adult is spelled A-D-U-L-T, and it was too cute to pass up, and so we did it that way. But in reality, it's ask plus understand that allows you to do. So if you're thinking about this from a logical standpoint, it would actually be ask, understand, do, live, thrive.
Yeah.
Talk about this next.
Adult just doesn't quite have the same ring to it. Doesn't work.
It's got a ring, but it's not a good one.
No, not really.
So we're not trying to rewrite the English language here, so we'll stick with the acronym. But this idea of do is this action-based component. And David, I think one of the things that we see a lot in Unbound is that we live in a world that has really convinced, now our world would be the Western world, and specifically probably the United States, but just Western culture in general, has really convinced people that we really are in a knowledge-based economy. I actually think that's false, so we've talked about that in other episodes. That's something a little bit different. But the knowledge-based economy, meaning that answers are really prevalent, answers are really important, knowing these things. And my observation is that really takes us out of the do. It takes us out of the action. And so there's a whole lot of theory and there's a whole lot of content, but there's not a whole lot of action. And so this aspect of this educational framework that we use really focuses on the action. I don't know if you have observations on that from your experience.
Yeah, well, I just think Western culture in general is just the fact that we have entered the information age. And I think, based on your observation, I think there is a pretty reasonable argument that to some extent we are still in an information age, but like we talked about last episode, which for reference, if you have not listened to the last episode, you should, because the fact that we are in a questions-based paradigm changes how we're going to talk about all of the rest of this stuff. But I think, as we laid out in that last episode, information is so prevalent now, and we are in that age where we are in an information age where it is not just about what sort of information is available to us. Now the problem is how do we find the right information, and then what do we do with it? And it's so easy for a lot of us at this point to get paralyzed at the how do we find the right information step, to the point where we don't actually do anything about it. And I think, especially to add on to that, the internet and just remote work in general, which for reference, we're a remote work company, like pretty much all of us work remotely for the vast majority of the things that we do. I'm not decrying that necessarily, but I think in general, that sort of environment has made it very easy for us to be doing not nearly as much as we actually should be when we are, in fact, just spinning our wheels and trying to sort through all the information and not actually taking action on it.
Yeah, there is something interesting about working remote is that, my experience is that working in an office is that there's an awful lot of people who are good at looking busy. And I don't mean that as an indictment of them for being lazy. I mean that there is a performance aspect of working in an office where it's like, oh, somebody's really busy. They work through lunch and they're here early and they go late. But you find out they're really not working. To your point, David, they're kind of pushing information around. And so that's kind of what we're getting at here. Remote work is interesting because you can also do that in remote work, or sometimes remote work's different because people can't see you working. They don't know what you're doing. They can only gauge it by the results. And so sometimes that can strip it away and can push you more into this action piece. But there is an aspect here where, we're in an information age. And so we have a lot of time on theory and a lot of time on knowledge and a lot of time on acquiring information, because many of us are doing work that is not physical. And what I mean by that is it's pretty tough to have a hard time judging whether you dug a hole or not. If your job is to dig a ditch or dig a hole, I mean, the hole is there or the hole is not there. And not only that, but you get pretty quickly, you can figure out how long it takes to dig a hole. And so the hole is there in a reasonable amount of time or it's not there in a reasonable amount of time. But you'll get into sort of knowledge economy work and you get the kind of information jobs. There's a lot of variety. There's a lot of different factors. It's difficult to know exactly how long something can take. And sometimes it's even hard to track and see whether something's being done or not.
Yeah, I mean, I can spend an entire 8-hour workday just trying to work on the back end of our website and just try to make our pages load 30% faster. And yes, maybe when you type in our website URL, our website loads, a second or two faster than it used to. But aside from that, I don't actually have anything tangible to show for putting in 8 hours of work besides me sitting here at my screen doing that. And so while, yes, I was definitely working hard when I was doing all of that, it is just something weird in our brains where it's just like, I've been working hard on this, but I haven't actually produced anything tangible. It feels weird. There's this disconnect.
Yeah, come to think of it, I don't know. What do you do, David? I mean, I'm not...
I make the website load 30% faster, Jonathan. That's what I do.
But we're joking about this, but look, folks, I have no questions about David's working hard. That's not it. And I've seen him at events. I know that the man does not have a lazy bone in his body. But here is an interesting reality to the world that we live in. In all honesty, I know what David's title is. I know that he's essential to our operation. But if you ask me what David does on a day-to-day basis or how he does the things he does, I don't know the answer to that. And in fact, it would be hard for almost anybody to know the answer to that because the things that David does change on an almost constant basis because he does a lot of ad placement at social media companies and things like that, constantly changing. That is a relatively modern reality. And most times and places, in my position, I would know exactly what David did because I came through the same path he did. In other words, for those of you who have ever seen our triangle trainings, there's a storytelling wing to a business, there's an operational wing to a business, there's a vision wing to the business. The vision is kind of the leadership, and you generally come to the storytelling wing or you come to the operations wing. I came to the storytelling wing. David is on the storytelling wing. And so in times past, I would know everything that David did because I would have put in all my time and all my reps doing the same thing. I did do that on technology that no longer exists today, right? On marketing platforms and on marketing systems that are completely irrelevant to today's world. And so in some aspect, I know some of the basics of David's job, but I don't know any of the technical aspects of it. And that's a weird kind of an anomaly of the world that we live in.
Right. Or, well, just the other reality of it is that most of the time in a lot of settings, the person who is supervising you is probably most of the time working right next to you, or at least in the same building as you, and is working on the same tangible objects, or even just working on the same service as you are. And so there is some sort of level where you can actually watch what they're doing. And in this case, it's hard for you to actually physically watch what I'm doing unless we happen to be working in the same space together and you're looking at my screen and watching the things that I'm doing or watching pages pop up as I publish them and things like that.
Which I just, for the record, I'm not really super interested in doing. So, David, your home office is safe from invasion from me.
I so appreciate that.
I'm sure relieved to hear that. So there'll be no screen sharing software put into Unbound here. And if it was, David would have to put it in. He could probably get a workaround, so the whole thing would be a moot anyhow. But the point of doing all this is that when we talk about do, there is an aspect here where understanding what it means to actually produce value has become essential because it's not as obvious as it was before. And I want to kind of draw these kind of distinctions, right? If the value is digging a hole so I can set a fence post in it, I know the value of the hole. And if David was doing it, I know the value to me because I didn't have to dig the hole, right? And so that freed me up to do something else. That if David came and dug a hole for me to put the fence post in, and that was our working relationship, the value would be instantly understandable. I could see the quality of the hole. I could see the time it took to dig the hole. And I would know that him digging the hole meant that I did not have to dig the hole, which would be fantastic, especially where I live, where there's rocks right underneath the topsoil. Now, change that to our current situation. David does something that is invisible to me. Now, the results of blowing the website does not sound that spectacular. I reload the website and it's 1 second faster, big deal. But cumulatively, on the thousands of people that visit our website, it's a massive deal for our company. But even that is abstracted. I can't really even experience it myself. And then the reports that we would pull to say that this makes it better are also somewhat abstract. I can't see it. I can't feel it. I have to understand the data that's behind it. And that's the nature of what David is doing every single day. And so now we have to ask this question. Is David trained in the art of getting things done, where he has an objective idea of the kind of value that he's creating for the company, and he is able to both create that value, which is really important, and make sure that people around him understand the value that's being created? And those two things become essential in a way that they've never really done before. You could easily sort. I'm really good at digging holes. I'm really not good at digging holes. You can see it instantly. Now David has to be really good at optimizing websites, and he has to be relatively good at making sure that everybody understands why optimizing websites is a good thing. And then he has to have an inherent integrity that makes him want to optimize websites faster and better than anybody else, because that increases the value, even though it's very unlikely anybody in our company is going to be able to evaluate whether he's fast or not. Now, I just want our audience to sort of sit back and think about that reality shift, because what I described for David is the majority of the working situations out there versus what a generation or so ago would have been the exact opposite. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah. And I think especially a lot of our listeners who might be in some sort of a corporate world will understand that this is especially true whenever you have consultants come in. The whole field of consultants in general, I think, it's always been a little bit of an abstract field, but I think even more now than ever, it's been just such an interesting case where there will be so many very large claims made over what they do, but then it's increasingly harder and harder to actually tangibly prove what sort of value is there. And for the record, I do a little bit of consulting work on the side when I'm done with my work for Unbound, and I work really hard to make sure that any of my clients can very clearly understand that for what they are paying me for, this is exactly what I did, this is exactly the amount of time that I spent on it, and this is exactly the value that it is providing. And that's something that, is very unique and is going to be an increasingly important skill in demonstrating that as a young professional or as a professional in really any stage of your career, just in the modern day.
So when we talk about do in this framework, we want to first start with, what does it look like to create value? What does it mean to actually produce something? What is the integrity behind that? And how do we train people to optimize doing those things? And so when you're thinking about this in terms of somebody listening to this, just understand that this place where what you're doing intersects with what needs to be done, right? Where you actually create value. That's important. It sounds abstract because in most of our work it is, which means people that are able to understand what is actually going on, to do that well and interpret that to other people, have significant advantages. So that's worth knowing about. The second piece here is a little bit more philosophical, and then we're going to come back to a little bit more practical. And the philosophical piece is that I would argue that the accumulation of knowledge just to stack up knowledge is sort of like somebody who accumulates money and just sticks it in a mattress or sticks it in a vault somewhere, right? I mean, there is value there, but it's not realized value because it's not working at all. Money stuck in a vault may be safe, but it's not earning anything. It's not being put to work. We might even say money in a savings account is not earning much. It's kind of underperforming. Money that would be really working would be money that gets invested into businesses and ventures, some of which will be successful, some of which won't be. But that's money that actually makes a difference in the world. And we would say the same thing about knowledge, that you have to ask and you have to ask questions and you get information and you accumulate that information. But for the information to really make a difference in the world, to mean something, it has to be put to use. And that's the action point. And that requires both the will to put it to use and the understanding of what's going on. It also requires the understanding that putting it to use may result in things not going the way you expect, which is another fancy way of saying failure, right? Mm-hmm. And so doing, ask and do, ask is, having this question-based paradigm. Do is actually about taking that information and applying it and applying it with some boldness, knowing that failure is an option, but failure is not fatal. And to be able to do that. And often those who do the fastest and fail the fastest learn the fastest and then actually succeed faster than everybody else. And that is a bit of a contradiction that's worth, leaning into a little bit. It's about action that often requires leads to failure, but those who fail first learn the fastest and ultimately end up succeeding before the people who are more tentative.
Yeah, there's several things there that I think are really interesting points that I think are worth going back to. I will kind of poke a little bit at one of the assertions that you made towards the beginning of that statement, which is that just gathering knowledge for the sake of itself is unhelpful. I think I generally agree with your point. However, if you have the right mindset, there is very little actually useless knowledge that you can require. I think just about any knowledge that you can require, if you have the right mindset to it, can be useful to some extent. Because, in my opinion, is from my perspective, I think pretty much anything that you can learn about, any sort of knowledge that you can gain, can give you more of an ability to understand context and understand more about the world around you, how things work, and it can allow you to draw parallels between different things that maybe one thing doesn't seem relevant at the moment, but then down the line it can actually have some sort of relevance. And to give you an example of a way that I've seen this play out in my life is that when I was in high school, I was really interested in music production, and I thought that I was going to be able to get into the music production industry and, do lots of production work for big artists and things like that. That did not end up working out whatsoever. But what I did end up learning from getting into that and learning a lot about it, even though I didn't actually end up using it in the actual practical sense of producing music, was that I ended up taking that and it ended up leading to me getting opportunities to do live sound mixing for my church. And then that ended up leading me to do live AV for Unbound events. And so at the moment, you could have looked at that knowledge gathering and said, that's not actually necessarily useful, but later down the road, that ended up being something that was very useful to me. Does that make sense? Is that kind of like striking a little bit at what your point was saying?
Yeah, in fact, I don't know if there's a disagreement here. I would say that the thing that I think is helpful to illustrate is that knowledge isn't really experience used until it's put to work. And I would agree with you. All knowledge, it ends up being useful, but you generally discover that usefulness and in its application. And so there's definitely a bit of a caution here. I think learning is fun for its own sake. I read books about things that I don't do professionally and that I'm never going to do. An example I think I've maybe used in the past is that I really was interested in boats, including sailboats, but I live inland in the Shenandoah Valley, and so canoes are about the biggest craft that we have. So I've learned a lot about boats over the years. I've read a lot about boats. I've read a lot about ocean voyages. I don't take ocean voyages. I don't own a large yacht. I'm never going to own a large yacht. I don't even really have a desire to own a large yacht, but I have really been fascinated learning about it, right? And so there's an interest in learning that has been really fun, and I have learned lots of interesting things. But there is an aspect where that knowledge is somewhat latent until it's applied. And in my case, it's not so much applied in a big yacht, but it's that, I have sailed small boats, and some of the things I had read about now made more sense. Even some of the naval history I'd read in the 18th century made more sense, having tried to sail a small craft and have that, respond to the wind and all those kinds of things. And so there's an aspect here where knowledge really becomes deep-seated, becomes actualized in a sense when it is put to use. And so to some extent, the action part is the explanation point or the period, the finalization of the learning process. You acquire the information through asking questions, and then you understand the information, and we're going to talk about understand in our next episode. You understand that information primarily through applying it and doing something with it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense in that that's a very good distinction in that knowledge is only so useful until it actually has some sort of application. And I think, there is some level of usefulness to just knowing things for the sake of knowing things. If nothing else, you can get pretty good at trivia games. And that in and of itself is a pretty fun skill to have. And
But that's putting it to use, right? I mean, like when you're the
Right.
one that has all the obscure answers at Buffalo Wild Wings or wherever it is that you're having the competition, there's some definite use to that. And it sharpens your ability and desire to learn more of it because you got the social feedback from it. So there is another aspect of this, though, that's a little bit more practical, but it's also a pitfall. And so working with students, we see this a lot, which is when we really press this do and action, then, you have people that want to be productive and they want to produce things, they want to do things. There is an easy trap to fall into where you derive your self-worth through what you do, how much you do it, and how well you do it. And the people hosting this podcast are not exempt from this temptation. But what happens then is that from a spiritual standpoint, practically speaking, this is, if the enemy can get to you by making you lazy and not use your gifts and not actualize any of the things that are around you, that is definitely one way to sort of separate you from the one who made you. The other way to do that is to have you be hyper productive, hyper focused on performance, and start to think that your worth is derived from how well you perform. And often this is most deadly when it starts with good intentions. I'm blessed by God and I want to use my blessings well. And so I'm going to work really hard and do these things. Also, people like me when I work really hard and do these things, and they say nice things about me. And so it's all gets caught up in this weird little bundle where you're now performing for other people and it bleeds into actually performing for God. And that's how your identity and that's how your self-worth is derived. And we want to make sure that as you listen to this, while we're certainly putting ideas into action, taking action, failing and failing fast and learning and failing forward and all those good things, we're also warning you against equating your performance or even your energy with your worth. Because the performance and the energy and all that things comes after your worth has already been established. And this is a critical foundational point that you absolutely can't have this discussion about without fully understanding.
Oh, man, it's so important to stress this. One of the enemy's foremost skills is taking good things and twisting them so that they take the wrong priority in our lives and they end up becoming some of the most destructive things. And I think this is a prime example of that in looking to do and take action on good things and to make a difference in the world and to have amazing opportunities and just create change. But at the same time, when we view that as our identity, when that is the worth component, then it is completely out of whack. And I think I would even go so far as to say, I think for just the broader Western culture in general, especially with what we were talking about earlier in the podcast, with so much more of our work not being very tangible, not being nearly as present and not feeling quite as real as it once was, I think that's a huge contributor to the meaninglessness that we find and just the hopelessness that we find that is so prevalent in our culture, is that now people are working really hard to do things well, and they're not even actually able to see the results of it. They're able to see the results less and less and less. And so when you don't have that core anchor of my value is not in and of my actions and my own worth that is given to me by God instead of my actions, then all you have it tied to is something that you can barely even see, that you can barely even understand. So it's just a very ungrounded and unstable way to try to live your life if you don't have that foundation.
So as we're thinking about this, it's helpful to put things in order. And so it is true that people who do things and who know how to do things have some self-satisfaction, have some confidence, have some innate, charisma that is important. I was just had a conversation with somebody at my house recently, and they were just talking about the importance of young people learning a trade, even if they don't want to practice that trade as their profession. The dignity, the worth that comes with the confidence that comes from being able to fix something, build something, create something is really important. Okay, that's true, but the question is asking why. So like if your trade, if you've learned how to do intricate cabinetry work with hand tools, all right, and you say, okay, but the ability to do the perfect dovetail and to put together this cabinet in just this flawless way and make it look really good, that's a reflection of who I am, and that's a reflection of my worth and dignity. That's a defeat. right? You're on the wrong thing. At the same time, when you say my ability to do this is a reflection of a God who made me. I was made in God's image, and God gave me the ability to be a creator like God was. And I'm not creating new things ex nihilo like God, because I'm not God. I'm taking the things that God made, using these raw materials, I'm shaping it into something else. This reminds me of my identity. So key language there. This is not my identity. It's not who I am. This reminds me of my identity. This is a reflection of the one who made me. And this reminds me that I'm fearfully and wonderfully made with these gifts and abilities. And so I have an appreciation for who I am. And I have appreciation for the gifts that I have been given that really increases my confidence and my understanding of who I am in the world, but in the context of who gave that to me. And so that's the first part. The second part is when you say, well, I'm deriving my worth from the work that I'm doing. God has blessed me, and so therefore I must give back. And so, this is a fashion of gauging how much God will love me by how much work I do. You may listen to that and go, no, that's not right. It isn't right, but it's also an absolutely common pitfall. I mean, this happens all the time, right? We see this particularly with our students. Instead, the order is, and this is going to be a little bit of a strange thing, but hang with me for a second. The order is you remembering that the world is so broken and you are just a human and that you are not able to fix even a small part of it. And if this sounds depressing, hang with me just a second. In fact, you know this because you are broken. You know there are parts of you that are wrong, that maybe are twisted and evil and have interesting complications, and you would like to drop them, and yet you can't. And so, you've either experienced this or you're going to experience this or you see this in something else. And so there's at some point where you come to this realization that it's too big. I can't defeat this thing inside my own heart. I can't defeat this evil out there. I can't fix these problems. They're all too big for me. And at that point, you've come to a realization and you have to do something with that. And the non-Christian response to that is almost always madness or despair. The Christian response to that is to say, no, this is God's business. God is in the business of fixing all things. God is the business of removing sin from our hearts. God is in the business of forgiving us for our sins through the death of his son, the Christ. All those things are done and accomplished only through God. Well, now we get to the Paul, by no means. Does that mean that I should not do any work because, God's taking care of these? By no means. Instead, we do the work. Why? We do that because of this awesome thing that happens to us. When God forgave us and took away those sins and promised us and gave us the hope that he will fix all things, make all things new, and destroy evil and all those kinds of things, he also said that this is not the end. This is the beginning for you. When you come to that realization, it's the beginning. And now I am enlisting you in my work. I am asking you to be a part of that redemption work. I'm telling you that you have a role to play. So, our jobs here at Unbound, can we fix all the things that are wrong with the educational system? No, we can't even fix all the things that are wrong in our company, on our website, right? Can we fix all the problems that come to us and all the students that have issues? No, we can't even fix our own issues. We all have our own problems and things that we struggle with and all those kinds of things. And yet, God asked us to participate in the restoration of all things. And so he allows us to participate in the work that he's doing. And in some fashion that's perhaps beyond our understanding, he blesses and redeems the work that we do, even though it comes from sinful people. And so all of a sudden that changes the whole dynamic, right? You're not working and you're not doing things in order to gain an identity. You're not doing things to gain status with God. You've already got that. Instead, you're doing things because God has invited you in to participate in what he is doing, and who wouldn't want to join that? And so understanding those things can do two things. It can help you from falling into the trap of the enemy, which is worth it all by itself, but it can also give you a purpose and a meaning and a drive to do things you can do. You can be a highly productive and a highly passionate person about what you're doing without being consumed by it and without it eating you and becoming your identity.
Yeah. The actions that we do, the doing is not fueling our value. Our value is fueling our doing. And having that value in place allows us to express that value, allows us to participate in that in a way that does not affect fail or succeed our value, because we know that that value ultimately comes from God. And we know that the results of our actions when we take them are also up to God. That's the cool part about it, is that we simply, he calls us not necessarily to success. He calls us to do our very best, to give all that we have And yes, that does mean to do a lot, to work as hard as we are able. But then ultimately the results are up to him. And so when we see whether or not our results, our efforts succeed or fail, that doesn't have to be something that disheartens us, because we know that whether that was ultimately a success in the long term or not, God may use that thing that we may look at as a failure way down the road later, and we may just not be aware of it, or we may never be aware of it until we see him in eternity. And so it's such a freeing thought that frees us to go and to do, and to do it with joy. And I think there's very little that's more exciting than that.
And the final point then is that work is worth doing. And work existed before the fall, and so it was part of what God wanted us to do in the first place. There is meaning in work, not that you derive your meaning from work, but there was useful work to do, is a fulfilling and dignity-giving action. And knowing how to create value is ultimately a blessing to both other people, because you're creating value for them, and for yourself, as it reminds you of a reflection of who God made you to be, what the gifts and skills he's given you, and an ability to participate in the work that he is doing. So as you think about that, I hope that's helpful to think in terms of an educational structure and paradigm that emphasizes that we live in a questions-based paradigm, that asking questions is often more important than knowing answers. Not that knowing answers is not important, but that every answer we know puts us in a position to ask a better question, and that information that we gain from asking those questions is best utilized by doing things. It's best understood when you put it to work, and it also allows you to participate in all the things that we were just talking about. On our next episode, we'll talk about understand, which, as a reminder, kind of precedes the do part. Ask and understand together allows you to then do. And so we'll go back and cover that. And if all of these things are interesting to you and you want to learn more about them in terms of the context of the program, you can go to beunbound.us. The adult educational framework we're talking about is deliberately, specifically, and intentionally built into every program that we run at Unbound. So that's Equip and Explore for high school students, and Ascend for high school seniors and post-high school. And you can go to those sites and learn more about those programs, because if you're involved in Unbound, we spend a lot of time talking about questions-based paradigm and taking action and doing things, which is why we call Unbound a project-based education company. That ultimately our best way of measuring the results of the learning that takes place in our students is by having them do real projects in the real world, with the emphasis on do. And now you know that's not accidental. David, any other final words before we finish up here?
Yeah, I would just say that it's a joy to be able to do this podcast, and it's something that, whether we have just a handful of listeners, or we've been seeing more and more that we have more than a few handfuls of listeners now, and it's exciting to see that. And I think it's just a joy to be able to produce this for all of you and to have these conversations. And ultimately, our goal is to create value for you all. So a big thank you to you all for listening, and we hope that you continue to join us as we continue releasing more episodes and continue breaking down the adult model and having more conversations to come.
And until we see you next time, be unbound.